right, so today we have Raiza Martin, co founder at Hux, which you can find at huxe.com. Tagline is it's your personal audio companion built to turn what you care about into beautifully generated interactive experience. And with that, Raiza, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Ben. Great to be here.
And so let's begin by rewinding a little bit. So you and your co-founders left Google Notebook LM team, which you led at the height of its buzz, really.
Yeah,
So what unmet need convinced you that this was the time to trade the comforts of big tech or the garage building uh, atmosphere of a startup?
I mean, it's such a great question. I think it was a very personal decision for all of us, which was, working on Notebook LM was incredible. It was a lot of fun. It's a great team. Google, of course, an incredible place to work. Notebook LM, I think it was such a pleasure to take it from an idea to something that resonated so widely with so many people. And I think we realized, AI is really blowing up, and the speed at which you can build, the speed at which you can iterate. I think that we ourselves didn't know what it would be like at a startup, but we wanted to experience it and we wanted to try. And, 7 months now down the road, we left in December. I think we made the right choice. We're having a great time, we're having a lot of fun, and it's certainly very different from being at Google.
And for our listeners who may not be familiar with Notebook LM, the 1% that are not familiar with Notebook LM, give us a 1 to 2 sentence description of Notebook LM.
Yeah, I mean, I always tell people it's different now because people are a lot more familiar with AI, but it's basically contextualized intelligence where, you give Notebook LM the sources that you care about in that particular moment, and Notebook LM stays grounded to those sources. And so, one of our most prominent use cases when we were there is students would create notebooks and upload their class materials, and then you automatically had an expert in all of those materials and you were able to talk with it back and forth, and that resonated pretty strongly.
And for our listeners, here's a power use case for Notebook LM. If you have your own house, put all your user manuals in there. So I have a home manual. I have all the appliances user manuals. And then if that's not enough, I run across a YouTube video. I put that in there for future reference. And you can do that across the board in every aspect of your life. So, for example, if you have a lot of health things you need to keep track of, you can do that as well.
Yeah. Yeah, actually that's really interesting that you mentioned that, Ben, because we have had a lot of people tell us that they use it for Airbnbs. So people who have their Airbnbs and they have people, that manage their home for them, they put all of the manuals in there, they put all the instructions in there, and then you're able to just talk to it as if it's an entity, and it's just one of those things where you're like, "Wow, AI does make these types of stories a lot better."
All right. So you folks decided to leave Google. So at this point, so what is the kind of the pain point? So why do people you believe need a personal daily podcast?
I think it's interesting because there are a lot of different ways that I think about building new products. I think on one hand, we can sort of think about like acute pain points and just try to solve them and solve it really well. But I think Hawks actually comes from a slightly different angle of building products, which we were really excited to try, which is what if we could try to build specifically very delightful things for people. And so the inputs or the triggers for building the product are a little bit different. Where, Steven and Jason, my co-founders, when we sat down and we talked about it, we tried to imagine sort of what the average person's daily life is like. And we thought about, we wake up, you maybe check your phone, you check your email, you travel to work or to school. We started mapping out what these moments look like for people. And we thought about where are there opportunities to try to make something more interesting or more delightful for people, right? Like I think a lot about TikTok, for example, which is When do you use TikTok? When do you use Instagram? It's like, oh, when I'm standing in line. Oh, I'm sitting on the couch. Oh, I'm watching TV. Right. So we tried to look for moments like this, and we actually landed on the transit time or the commute time. We were like, what is that time used for? Right? If people are just sitting in traffic or if they're going somewhere or they're walking somewhere, couldn't we do something interesting with that space of time that's also novel and interesting that helps us learn something new about what people want? And so, one of the first things we tried to experiment with was like, what if we could create really personalized audio content for people? And that was it. That was the provocation. What do people want to listen to? And we started with very basic things. We started with news. We started with your email. We start with your calendar. But I think, even in the short time that we've given this to people, we've learned a lot about how much opportunity there is in that space.
Hux is, I believe, audio first, mobile first, correct?
That's right.
So mobile first, obviously Notebook LM. I don't think of it as mobile first, right?
Right.
Uh, the audio first. So I I guess I get it when I'm going for a walk and things like that. But then these optimizers in the life hackers in Silicon Valley, right? So who either want to listen to audio at 10x speed,
Yeah.
or they don't even want the audio; they just want the transcript,
Yeah. Yeah. Of
right?
course.
Tell us why audio.
I mean, this one was probably a little bit, coming from our learnings from Notebook LM, which is I think that you just learn fundamentally different things when you change the modality of something. Where I actually realized this partially from Notebook LM and partially from my own use of ChatGPT, voice mode specifically. When I go on walks, I do this afternoon walk, and I go on a walk with ChatGPT. And I just talk about my day. I usually do a brain dump of like, here's what I was thinking today, here's what I was feeling, here's what happened to me. And I noticed that that was a very different interaction from when I type things out to ChatGPT. And that was really interesting. And then you have the flip side of this, which is less about the interaction and more about consumption for Notebook LM, where something about the audio format made the types of sources different as well. Like the types of sources that we uploaded to NotebookLM were different as a result of I want to get an audio output instead of just a text output, right? Like a summary. And so I think by just focusing on one modality, audio in particular, voice in, voice out, I think we'll learn different use cases than the chat use cases that we are pretty much all experiencing now, right? Which is like, okay, I use ChatGPT for work, I use it for some personal use cases. But for the most part, I think voice is still largely untapped. And I think a lot of people still have not tried, whether it's listening to AI or interacting with AI in this way. I feel like there's still a lot to learn there, and then we'll figure out more new products as a result.
And I think actually, even in text, people started exploring other form factors, so to speak, right? So there's the long articles, the so-called long reads, but then people started to innovate. Well, maybe there's a opening for bullet points, kind of the Axios kind of delivery. So, what kinds of things are available for voice in that dimension?
I think about this a lot in terms of like two formats. One is a passive format, one's an interactive format. And I break it down to those two categories to try to keep it really simple. But I think passive formats are in within that bucket, there's a lot of different things that you could create for the user. And I think the things that you end up playing with are more along the lines of one, what is the content about? Like what is in it? And number two, how flexible is that content? Right? Like how short is it? How long is it? How fast is it? How malleable is it to the user's feedback? And so I think that's one component of passive content consumption. On the second hand, there's interactive content consumption, which is maybe I'm listening to an audio, but I actually want to interact with it. Right? Maybe I actually want to join in. Maybe I want my friends to join in. Maybe I want to share a conversation that I had with an AI and I want to publish it for some reason. I think that both of those concepts, particularly in AI, are new. And so today I don't have words or terms for what these formats are other than one is a passive mode, one's an interactive mode. But I think this is what's going to start to emerge in the next 5 to 10 years or so, maybe even a lot sooner, quite frankly. And I think what we'll learn is that, you know, the types of things we want to use audio for are going to be fundamentally different than the things we want to use something like chat for or even video.
So, what are some of the key lessons or things to avoid from the smart speakers?
For the smart speaker, oh my gosh, I mean, that's tough because I've owned so many of them.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
And I love them. I
There
always love.
were, there was a time when people were like, "Oh my God, this Alexa skills,
Yeah,
we'll build, and this is going to be huge." But then it kind of petered out. Right?
I I agree. I mean, I remember this, and that's why my house is full of them. And I'll be honest with you that my primary use case for the smart speakers is still a timer. And I think that's most people, right? Like, that's how we use the smart speakers. We set a timer and it's great. Like, it works in the kitchen, but it's very expensive. It doesn't live up to the promise. I think there's probably two lessons that I would take away from that. One is that I just don't think the technology was ready for like what people really wanted to do and what people were really saying to the speakers or how we expected it to work. I just don't think we were quite there, right? Like, it's kind of hard to think about now how that could have worked without AI as we know it today. The second thing that I would say is one of the primary and most difficult things about audio is that there is no UI, right? A smart speaker is a physical device. Often, if there's a screen, it's not like it tells you what to do. And so the learning curve is steep. So if you put those two things together, right, you have a technology that's quite limited. So it only does, let's say, whatever, 5 or 10 things. And you have a UI that doesn't tell you what the 5 to 10 things are. And so now you have a user that's like, well, I don't know what to use the thing for. I'm just going to use it for a speaker. But I think if you take where we're at, the point in time where we're at today, now it can do so much more that maybe it's okay that even if you don't have a UI, the user can just try things based on what they want, and then it will actually just do it, right? It can be delightful in that way. But I think there is a risk to the extent that like it still requires input from the user. And this is, for us, this is what we're constantly trying to work on, which is like, how do we think about a system that is actually so supportive of the user that you don't have to come up with how to try it or how to make it work? And so I think that's naturally, the challenge and the learnings from the smart speaker era.
It's interesting you point out the UI because on the one hand, the chatbot, right? So text, I have to type something. The the smart speaker, one thing that started creeping people out was the potential for surveillance,
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
right? So what say you, Raisa, about will Huck surveil me?
Well, I think I'll tell you a little bit of what I think the concern is around surveillance with smart speakers, and I think there's actually something kind of simple about it, which is with a wake word, right? Like, because all smart speakers are triggered by wake words, whether it's "Hey Google" or I'm not gonna say the other one because my
Yeah,
phone's
yeah.
But the thing is it presumes that it's always on, right? The user knows, like, "Hey, if I say something, it's probably picking it up, and it's probably logged somewhere." And I think to a certain extent, like, that's creepy, right? It's like, "Oh, if it logged everything that I said, passively without me even interacting with it, what does it mean?" And so, I think with Hux, I'll say 2 things. I think number 1, we want to be really careful about where we believe, you know, the consumer readiness is. Like, you wanna push just a little bit, but not too far, because I think if you push too far, people get creeped out, and then they just stop using things. But if you push just a little bit, it might feel a little uncomfortable at first, but then there is the opportunity for it to be delightful. And so I think for Hux, because it's an app, you have to turn it on to use it. It's clunky in some ways because it's not as easy as a wake word, but I think we can sort of push on that boundary and see, are people ready for something that's like more ambiently on? And that's my second point, which is I think we're starting to see the emergence of more tools that are just always on and always listening. Like I think about granola. You look at the recent launch of Cluely, right? Like they're just always on, looking at your screen, recording your audio, transcribing your audio. Um, and I myself am really curious, are we actually ready for technology like that? Because I think, in real life, you can probably get the most utility from something that is always on, but whether or not consumers are ready for it is still TBD.
So you're ingesting things, right? So calendars, email, and whatever else of the users, right? So what about privacy, right? So Apple, for example, is famous for homomorphic encryption and other things, right? So supposedly leaving all that data on device.
Yeah.
So what are the steps you've taken?
So for us, we're very privacy focused and we're very privacy first. I think this comes from when I was building Notebook LM. We very specifically wanted to make sure that we were very respectful of user data as much as that we could possibly be. And so that's why for Notebook LM, we didn't train on any user data. User data stayed private. We are taking largely the same approach with Hux, which is I think email data is really sensitive, calendar data is really sensitive, conversation data is really sensitive. And so the way that we treat that type of data that you share with Hux is largely to just improve your personal experience. But not, when we think about data, it's like, okay, you can use it to improve the experience of all, or you can use it to improve the experience of an individual. And I think that there is something interesting about trying to create much more personalized recommendation models that don't really influence sort of more broadly, the utility of your data doesn't have to go beyond your usage of the app. And so for us, it's a little bit harder, I think, in the short term to try to build something good in this way. But I think it's more privacy respecting. And ultimately, I think that's what it takes to get people to trust what you're building.
Yeah, so for example, Hux may notice, hey Ben, I noticed that you have a flight tomorrow. And by the way, Ben, your flight is delayed. So
Hmm.
the fact that it checked that my flight is delayed, it might have pinged an external service,
Yeah.
and now that external service knows about me somehow.
Oh, I think that's a really good point. And I think that if you imagine maybe this is like kind of a weird way to frame it, but I think about building hacks in this way, which is if I were to be in your pocket, like me personally, and I wanted to help you, what would I do? Right. And in this case, let's pretend I saw an email, or a calendar thing that said, like, hey, Ben has a flight at like 4 p.m. today. I could go check that flight without leaking any of your personal information. I could just look up the flight number. And I think there's probably a lot of cases like this where you can provide utility that doesn't take for granted the user data, but also doesn't need to like leak it to another service. And so there are a lot of things like that that we're doing with Hux right now, like trying to understand things that are much more action oriented. Like the example that you gave is actually like a very action oriented one, which is I know you have a flight coming up. Let me give you a flight status. Let me give you the weather. Let me give you. We try to do this today already, like traffic. We try to tell you you have a meeting at 4 p.m. It's an SF, but it's going to take you 3 hours to get there. These are things that we can do without, stepping on user privacy.
The way you describe the system, it's for me, there's no social component, right? So, but you end up learning things about me. So, for example, if I listen to certain podcasts or read certain news items and things like that, so there is the potential for also building it's a more sophisticated filter bubble.
Hmm. Yeah.
So, so how do you make sure that I am ingesting things beyond my filter bubble?
That's I think, a really good philosophical question that sort of comes down to what I believe a person should or shouldn't be consuming. And I think that one's always a tricky one because I think, we've seen what these feeds can do to us and like the way we think about the world because we spend so much time on these feeds. And I don't know the correct kind of formula yet, right? I think that there is also something interesting about how do I get enough user input? Like I think about Pinterest a lot, which is it's not a great example because I hate things where you have to set it up, right, in order to use it. But there is something about, what signal can I get from the user? so that I can give them a much better experience and then keep going from there. And then there's also like the signal that comes in from things like your email and your calendar. And so when I imagine what populates a user's feed, I try to think about it from the perspective of relevance and less from an editorial perspective of like, okay, I think Ben, whatever, let's pretend you skew on one side of an opinion. I'm going to show you the opposite of an opinion. I don't necessarily know if I need to do that. I think that the relevance of information is probably enough for it to be a utility. And I think that we'll probably test this in real life in the very near future once we start actually surfacing much more personalized information to people. And we'll see where it goes. I'll say that the other thing that's probably really important is surfacing the correct controls to the user for saying, hey, I like this, here's why. I don't like this, here's why not. Right. And it's like where you inject tension in the system, where you think the system should push back. I think that takes just a little bit of time to figure out how to do it right.
So what about the boundary between giving me content and providing me companionship?
I mean, I love that one because I think about this. I think about this a lot. Actually drew a chart of this where I was like, how do we know what the difference is between an assistant and a companion? If fundamentally the capabilities are the same, what makes one thing an assistant and a companion? I actually ended up in a place where I was like, I don't actually know if the question matters because, the user will use it how the user intends to use it. But I think where that question matters most is actually in the packaging and the marketing of something, right? I mean, I encounter people who talk about ChatGPT like it's their best friend. I encounter people who talk about ChatGPT like it's their employee. And I think there's something really fun about you get to decide what the thing is. But I think it also makes it a little bit harder for other people to use the thing as a result because you're like, well, which is it, right? Is it a friend or is it an assistant? Is it an employee? Which is it? And so I think that on a capabilities level, they're probably the same thing. But I think on a marketing or a packaging level, they're very, very much different. For Hux, the way that I think about this is which set of use cases do you prioritize to make sure that those work extremely well? Because beyond just like a simple conversation, the capabilities will probably start diverging. And I think that's the part that's probably really really much more interesting and I think that there's probably some number of things that those two share and we might do those things first.
You're now part of a very small startup, not part of this tech giant, right? So I'm assuming you folks don't build your own models, so you're using external models, right? So walk us through privacy and all of that, given the fact that you're using external models, and do as that model learns more about me, how much does that model retain over time, right? Because basically, in order for it to be a really good companion, you can't be clearing that cache every time I log out, right? So
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's a really good question that I think pertains to how we think about where we store data, how data is passed off, who it's passed off to. And so when we use the commercial models, we opt for the models that don't train on the data that we send them. So that's like very specifically, a P0 for us. And then the next layer of that, I would say, is I think you alluded to this a little bit. It's how we think about continuity because people increasingly expect that, when I use ChatGPT, I expect ChatGPT to have knowledge of all the conversations I've ever had with it. And for you to support that, you have to build like a very durable context layer. But I don't think you necessarily have to imagine that all of that stuff gets passed to the model, right? Like you can think about a lot of like technical limitations actually prohibit you from doing that anyway, right? Because you can't like put the entirety of all your conversations in the context window, but you can think about what is the process by which, when we're having a conversation, it just happens so quickly. We take it a little bit for granted but it's like I am accessing only parts of my memory and only parts of my knowledge. And so we try to simulate a lot of that with Hux as well. But in terms of user privacy, that layer is stored at the application layer. And so that is not something we are constantly passing to models. That's something that we store and then we figure out what's the right set of things to pass to the model, and we try to pass as little as possible to the model depending on what the user is talking about. And so there's a much more complicated process. Maybe we can simplify it in the future, quite frankly. There's a complicated process that we do around trying to figure out exactly what it is you're trying to talk about and then initiating model calls on top of that.
So you all are from Google, so I know that you measure. So what are some of the metrics that you're really paying attention to in terms of signals that, hey, we've really crossed a chasm here? For
Yeah.
I don't know what they might be minutes, right? So engagement minutes.
I mean, that's such a good question because I think that first, there's two things. I think one, I think about metrics a little bit differently in the super, super early stages. And the second is that I think that the metrics in the very beginning are actually a little bit non obvious because you'll get a lot of trial behavior in the beginning where there's a lot of curiosity. People want to try your product, they want to see what it's about. And it's a little bit harder to understand that initial user experience from the raw metrics itself. There's like some basic ones that I always care about. Like I care about like the rate at which people are able to onboard, the rate at which they're able to actually try the product. So just like very quality specific metrics, I always care about those. But to your question about how do I know if I've crossed the chasm, I think of product building as a series of chasms that never end. And so for me, the first one that I look for, and I actually tell this, I give this advice to people all the time, is when somebody uses your product, you only look for two types of people. You look for people that really love it and they rave about it. And you can barely understand what they are saying. You're like, I don't actually know why this person likes it so much, but they're so into it. You have to listen to that person. And then there's the second person who hates it. Just like absolutely hates it, right? Not randomly, but like actually used it and then hated it. I think like ultimately, like when you listen to these people, what you discover is that they were expecting it to do something. Like their expectation was really high for some reason. They were like, that's the thing I really wanted it to do. And then it didn't do it. It let me down. And so you try to listen to these two camps of people. And if you have these two groups, you're able to really triangulate like, hey, here's what my product looks like from the outside world. And so the thing I'm trying to measure is probably less like, oh, is the thing a hit? The thing I'm trying to measure is the market ready for it? Is the market ready for something like this weird? Because I think in real life, you sort of imagine that you know what product you're building, you know how to measure it. But I think, especially in the AI world, the reality is that you're probably testing consumer readiness and consumer need and how those two things are evolving together more than anything else. And I feel like, we did this with NotebookLM, which was like, we showed it to a bunch of people. A bunch of people were like, this is stupid. I don't understand it. But then when we showed it to students, there was like, 0 time in between them seeing it and them understanding what it was, and we showed it to them before ChatGPT even existed. And so there was no primer for AI. And it was just one of those things that's like, "Oh, that's remarkable," right? Like, they understand it because their need is so great. And so, for me, that's the first chasm is can you find people that understand what it is, that thing something that they think it is, and they feel something strongly about it. And so that's really what I'm looking for right now.
By the way, the odd thing about Notebook LM is the thing that really made it blow up was the whole podcast thing, which is not at all how I used to think. So now that you folks are outside of Google, what would you like these foundation model builders to focus on now that you are relying heavily on their models and you're on the outside? So you're, for example, in your case, audio, right? So
Yeah.
what aspects of the model of these models would you like to see improvement?
My gosh, I mean, we share so much feedback with the model providers. I actually feel a little bit like kind of nice on the outside because I can provide feedback to all the labs and not
Yeah.
just not just Google. And so that's been a lot of fun. I've actually really enjoyed that. And I'll say that I think that the universe of things right now is pretty well known. I don't think we have touched the space where we're actually pushing for totally new things yet. Like I think we'll get there. I think the model labs know what it is that they need to build right now. But I think latency is always one that I think we try to drive down, right? Because you think about the conversation we're having, right? There's no latency between you and I. It's just a conversation. You can interrupt me, I can interrupt you. I think there's like some basic sort of very human-like behaviors there that the models need to get better at. We think about things like tool calling, making that better and parallelizing it along with like the actual voice model synthesis. I think that's pretty critical to building an actually good experience. I'd say even just like the diversity of voices and languages and accents, that sounds really basic, but that's like actually pretty hard. And so I think, in terms of like all the model providers, I would say like those top three things are pretty well known, but feel like it will probably still take us through the rest of the year to see more of those emerge.
And narrowing the gap between the cloud model and the on-device model.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's interesting too, because today I think we're making a lot of progress on the smaller on device models. But then when you start to think about supporting like an actual LLM and then supporting like an actual voice model on top of it, and then, what it would take for an app to actually support those types of models on device, and then what the experience is, I think it actually gets a little bit hairy where most people would just, like, abort and be like, "Okay, I'm back to, like, commercial models and, like, using APIs."
So let's close with a prediction. So, what's one prediction in the consumer AI space that you would make that you think most people would find surprising?
Oh, that they would find surprising. You know, I mean, I'll say this, I think a lot of people use AI for companionship more than we think, and I think not in the ways that, we even imagine, right? I think, almost everyone that I talk to, when I talk to them about their utility of ChatGPT or Claude, the utility is very personal. And there's, of course, like a lot of work use cases, but you hear more and more. I would say, like, the more emerging side of AI is actually on the personal use cases and not the work ones, because the work ones are pretty well known and defined and finite. Whereas the personal ones, I think, have a lot more area for discovery. And what I specifically mean about this is, for example, like I use ChatGPT as my running coach. Like ChatGPT ingests all of my running data and it creates running plans for me. And when I run, I have voice mode on. And it's just like a really interesting use case where I'm like, I don't know where I would slot that in. Right? Like that's not necessarily productivity, but I'm not talking to it like it's my best friend. Like it's just my running coach. And I think more and more people are actually sort of doing these sort of complicated personal things that are closer to companionship than I would say traditional enterprise use cases.
You were supposed to say Gemini.
Why? It's so funny. I'll be honest, like I love all of the models. I have a use case for pretty much all of them. But I guess like that's another thing that's interesting is like we all just use all the models. I really don't know any people that use only one.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
fascinating.
Yeah. 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 And actually, what you're saying about the non-work use cases, that's so true, right? So I come across so many people who basically treat these chatbots as their friend.
Yeah. I mean, I do all the time now. I mean, it's so I think once you start doing it too, it's a lot stickier than some of the work use cases. Like I'll tell you, the other day, I had this like random thought. I took my dog to get groomed, and they were like, "Hey, can you upload his rabies vaccine?" And I had this thought. I was like, "How prevalent is rabies even?" Right? Like, how effective is the vaccine? Like, how well protected are the animals? Like, when was the last time a person got rabies in California? But it was one of those things where I was like, immediately open my ChatGPT app. I probably spent like 8 minutes talking about rabies with ChatGPT. And it was just like one of those things where I feel like the personal use cases are growing because people are becoming more curious. And now we have a natural outlet for this curiosity, where we now have immediate access to knowledge, like not just information, but knowledge. And it's so much fun. I think like there's so much opportunity for us to continue to explore that. And I think because of how generic the surface is for a lot of the chatbots, we're able to mold it into whatever we want it to be. And so I think there's just a lot of like super interesting use cases out there.
So then, doesn't this kind of indicate that these models will get sticky over time? So, in other words, if I end up talking to Gemini a lot, why would I switch over to ChatGPT? Gemini and I have a relationship, right?
I agree, I agree, and I think that we see that now where, for example, like, you probably I like Claude, I like Gemini, but I really like the ChatGPT app. Like, because the app is such a great experience for me, there's, like, no reason for me to switch, and I think the other thing is
Well,
it's
Gemini is free.
well, that's true. Okay, that's a really good point, but at this point in time, I've talked to ChatGPT so much that I'm like, "There's no way for me to port my data."
Yeah.
Right? Like, it would be really inconvenient for me, and so it becomes like a data lock-in. So, I think that's something that, like, if you wanna steal somebody's customer, you have to figure out the data lock-in.
So maybe Gnome was right after all. Character AI was ahead of its time. Yeah.
Character AI was ahead of its time. I love character AI. I think it's so funny.
Yeah. 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 And with that, thank you, Raiza.
Thank you, Ben. Thanks for having me.